live. Okay.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Red May, your 1 month vacation from capitalism. 43 events, 110 speakers. Wow. Maybe you'd like to know what's coming up. This is a special day. It's the only day we have 3 events. We're on our second here. We're going to hear about the organizing drive at Amazon. But before we get into that, let me fill you in with what's coming up at 5 p.m. today, and then some in the future. At 5 p.m., Value, Capitalism, and Communism, Jasper Burns, Cordelia Belton, and Kailash Srinivasan. Tomorrow at 11, no, I'm sorry. We have 2 days of rest, which we've well earned. And then we start again on Wednesday, May 26th at 11 a.m. with There Is No Unhappy Revolution, one of the great book titles of the year. Has Idris Robinson and Alessandra Renzi on it. At 5 p.m. on Wednesday, May 26th, Marx Asia History with Rebecca Carl, Gavin Walker, Ken Kawashima, and Assad Haider. On Thursday, May 27th at 11 a.m., Critical Theory in the 21st Century with Amy Diath, Chris O'Kane, Werner Bonefeld, and Christian Lotz. And at 5 p.m., a panel whose importance I could hardly overstate, Counterinsurgency Policing with Omedi Ochieng, Paul Passavant, Stuart Schrader, Tavis T. Harris, Paige May, Samantha Pre-Gonzalez, and Charmaine Chua is the moderator. On Friday at 11 a.m., Debt After Graeber, Collection and Repossession with Max Haven, Cassie Thornton, Radhika Desai, Lee Claire LaBerge, and Andrew Ross. And Friday at 3 p.m., What Just Happened with Joshua Clover, Jody Dean, Thea Ria Francos, Idris Robinson, Nicole Pal Singh. So do go to our website for more information on each of these panels, www.redmayseattle.org, and also go to our website if you want to donate, because as you might imagine, we get no institutional funding. You can give to our GoFundMe, Fan the Flames of Red May, or you can become a patron, which sounds very, very 18th century. I'm a patron of Red May. Anyway, you can go at a $3 level, a $5 level, a $10 level, or a $20 per month level. So we depend on the kindness of strangers and on your generosity. But without further ado now, we're going to go to the moderator of today's panel on the organizing drive at Amazon. And let me give you the exact, David, what is the title of the panel, the exact title?
The title is Class Struggle and Racial Justice After the Defeat at Amazon in Alabama. But as
David McNally, as our moderator, I just want to say that David is the author of, David teaches at the University of Houston. He's the author of Blood and Money, Monsters of the Market, and Political Economy and the Rise of Capitalism, his first book, which I was just reading, and it's wonderful. David, take it away.
Thank you, Philip, and thanks to all of your volunteers at Red May. These events are really important for keeping a left critical intellectual tradition and practice alive, and you'll see some of that on display today. Let me also thank Spectre Journal, the sponsor of this panel with Red May. For those of you who don't know the journal, please check it out at spectrejournal.com. You will find that the current issue features a lead article by Robin Kelly on policing and racial capitalism. And the next issue, coming actually next week, includes Class Struggle and Racial Justice After Amazon, Eco-Socialism, Race, Class, and Brexit in Britain, and Black Women's Centrality to Class Struggle. Now, the context for our discussion today is definitely both the high hopes that were generated around the Union Drive at Amazon in Bessemer, Alabama, the drive that was lost some weeks ago by the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union, but also, of course, the immense disappointment that that defeat triggered. We, however, want to pull the lens back and ask some larger and wider questions about Black and labor radicalism in the South, in the US. We're going to move beyond a lot of stereotypes, because one of the things I heard a lot of was the claim that, well, of course, the Union lost, it's the South. And that was said in a lot of venues. It was said on social media. It was a commonplace assumption, even of some people on the left. And yet, as our two authors today are going to be pointing out to us, there are rich traditions and legacies of Black and labor radicalism in the South in general, in Alabama in particular, and even in Birmingham and Bessemer specifically. So it's a really great pleasure to be able to engage this discussion with two really important scholar activists. In my view, their books that we're going to be referencing are absolutely required go-to sources if you want to understand these radical traditions in the South. So let me introduce both of them, mention the books that we'll be talking about, and then I'm just basically going to be posing a set of questions to them. And of course, any of you who want to throw questions into the chat, we will get to them in the last part of the discussion. Let me begin by introducing Donna Murch. It's a really great pleasure to have Donna here. She's a professor of history at Rutgers University. She's the author of Living for the City: Migration, Education, and the Rise of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California, published by University of North Carolina Press, and a winner of the Phyllis Wheatley Prize for that book. Donna will be joined in the conversation by Michael Goldfield. Mike is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Wayne State University, the author of a number of books, but most recently, The Southern Key: Class, Race, and Radicalism in the 1930s and 1940s. And I'm going to be exploring with Donna and Mike aspects of these Southern Black and labor radical traditions that give us a very different picture, and which will allow us then to return to the question of the recent Union Drive at Amazon with a much deeper historical appreciation of both some of these radical traditions and ways in which future labor organizing might be able to yield successes rather than failure. But I'm going to have both of them start by just taking about 5 minutes each and telling us something about the main themes and arguments of their book. So Donna, let's start with you. Tell us more about Living in the City, Living for the City.
Sorry, I was muted. So Living for the City is a history really of a movement of Black consciousness and later Black power and Black radicalism. And it's a story that runs counter to what many of the narratives had been at the time that I was writing it, which is focusing on the South as the center of a nonviolent civil disobedience movement and the North as kind of the homeland and genesis point for Black power. And Living for the City is an argument. It's very apropos the discussion we're having about the role of the South in American politics, because it's an argument that the prehistory of the founding of the Black Panther Party is related to the Second Great Migration. So as the civil rights movement is taking place, you're seeing this massive outmigration from the South. And that really matters, because when you begin to talk about migration patterns, the South is not just a geographical region. We have many Southerners in the context of the collapse of the tenancy system that migrate to the West Coast and other parts of the country. So it's a story about how people bring militant traditions, what John Hope Franklin called the militant South, with them, and that it is actually Black Southerners who are the founders of the Black Panther Party in Oakland. Interestingly enough, my book is only about Oakland, but also we know that Fred Hampton In Chicago, his family was from Louisiana, rural Louisiana. So it's a story about the origins of the Panthers, but it's actually broader than that. It's a community-based history that looks at the party's founding in a study group at UC Berkeley and Merritt College at the time of this democratization, expansion of higher education. And it traces the trajectory of that movement, all in the context of the Second Great Migration.
Perfect. Thank you, Donna. And we're going to get back to a number of those themes that you just highlighted. Mike, could you say a few words for our audience about the central claims and arguments of the Southern Key? You're muted, Mike.
How's that? I'm
That's much better.
happy to be here and glad to be taking part in this conversation. First, I want to give a plug for Donna's book, which I think is absolutely wonderful. And of course, what Malcolm X said, there is no North in the United States. There's only up South and down South. So Donna's book focuses on up South, Oakland, but having been involved in the 60s and 70s in the radical movements, including civil rights and Black liberation movement, I was always struck by the differences between what was happening in Oakland and Chicago and Detroit, which are the two cities I know the most about and was politically active in. And Donna's class analysis of Oakland in particular gives us some indication of why the movement developed there as it did. And my reflection is why it was so different, particularly in Detroit, where the Panthers had virtually no impact, and where it was much more complicated in Chicago. So my book has 4 or 5 different themes, which I'll talk about if there are time. The first one is why the South has been so central to everything that's happened in the United States. And I start with Du Bois's insight. He says, when people wonder why there's no socialism in the United States, the answer to that question is why there's never been any liberalism in the South. That takes us, and that obviously starts with slavery and the legacy of slavery. But also at various times, there have been massive movements, some of them interracial, some of them quite solidaristic. My book talks about the movements in the 1930s and 1940s. I have some slides, but maybe I'll bring them up later. And particularly in Alabama, which by the early 1950s was by far the most unionized state in the South, 25% unionization. The biggest unions, particularly coal mining, steel, metal mining, were roughly half African-American, half white, very solidaristic, particularly with miners, metal miners and coal miners. And the unionization rate during that period was 25%, 70, 80% in the 5 counties around Birmingham, probably. And to put that in perspective, there is no state in the United States today which has 25% unionization. So Alabama had more unionization, some of the unions quite radical during that time. And what my book argues is that there were greater possibilities, not only in Alabama, but in other parts of the South that were lost, and that these failures led to the weakness of interracial unions. Some of them were destroyed. Some of them, like the steel workers, turned into basically racist unions around the country, and particularly in the South. And that left the civil rights movement with very few interracial labor allies in the South, leading to white backlash, the Republican Party making a decision to appeal to whites on a racist basis, which I trace. So Trump is sort of the logical conclusion of everything that's happened, and partly also to Democrats as well as Republicans from the early 1960s on. The other thing is there are various lessons about what works and what didn't work in terms of organizing unions in the South. Some of whose lessons are pretty relevant to things today. And I have, and maybe at that point, I'll bring up some slides. There have been actually more recently a number of successful organizing drives in the South, a minority of the union drives, but there's currently a strike going on among coal miners not too far from Birmingham at the Warrior Met Coal Company. Got some pictures. I don't know the composition of the workforce, but there's certainly Black and white workers together on the picket lines, and there's a number of women clearly identifiable. So it's an interesting struggle, and they seem like 100% solidaristic. There are other successful struggles that have taken place in the South, and so we can discuss what works, what doesn't work, and perhaps what could have been done in addition in the Amazon campaign in Bessemer.
Excellent, thank you. Both of your introductions really help us set up some of these themes. And Mike, you already touched on it, and Donna, I think you opened the door to the whole location, if you will, of Black and labor radicalism in Alabama specifically. And Don, I'm going to start with you. You won't be surprised by the anecdote I'm going to share with the audience based on all the research you did with your book. But I think a lot of people, certainly people were at the time, and I think a lot of people still are. So I'm going to recount this anecdote. In 1965, Kwame Ture, then Stokely Carmichael, and other young organizers with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee arrived in Lowndes County, Alabama. They wanted to organize and build a political organization in Lowndes County, which was 80% Black and had not a single registered Black voter. Not only were they really pleasantly surprised by the turnout that they got, particularly from Black farmers, from people working the land in Lowndes County, but they were quite shocked to see that a number from the older generation turned out to the meetings fully armed. They came with weapons. Now, Donna, you've already alluded to this, but could you just sort of share a little bit with the audience, both the significance of that experience in Lowndes County and the traditions that the SNCC activists were at the time discovering?
Yes, thank you. Well, I guess I would start out by answering and saying that Lowndes County is so important. So it was known at the time as Bloody Lowndes. It was a place that Stokely Carmichael described as feudal. And it was kind of the embodiment of racial capitalism in the South. You had a tenant class, tenant and sharecropper, that was almost entirely Black, landowners who were almost entirely white. You did have some poor white tenants, but a lot of them identified instead with the Party of the Rooster, whose slogan was "White is Right." So it was the segregationist Democratic Party. So it's in Lowndes that you actually see the genesis of the idea of a Black Panther Party. So when the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act is passed in '65, you have the federal government protecting Black people's rights to vote, sending out federal marshals. But what good is the right to vote if you don't have people to vote for? So it's at this point that Stokely Carmichael ascends to the leadership, later Kwame Ture, of SNCC, and they start organizing a political party that was called the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. But they used the Black Panther as a symbol. And there was a long tradition in Lowndes, because you had such high rates of illiteracy, that when people went to vote, it just showed a symbol. So the symbol for the white segregationist party was the white cock, the white rooster. And then the symbol for the Lowndes County Freedom Organization was the Black Panther. And it's out of this symbol which is reported in the Movement, SNCC's newspaper, which I found in one of the Panther archives. I found it actually in a Panther archive, this Movement newspaper from the fall of '66. So I don't have a smoking gun, but I think it's very likely that that was the transmission point to Oakland. And so you have that. I wanted to start with just that political framing of Lowndes County, because in keeping with Michael's wonderful book, the South as a kind of laboratory of militants that influences people all over the country and is very important. The idea that, again, Black power was thought of as a Northern phenomena, but the very symbol that came to embody it came out of this rural county in Alabama. In terms of traditions of Black armed self-defense, I feel fortunate to be part of a whole generation, largely of Black historians who have written about Black radical movements and have kind of excavated a history of Black armed self-defense, which you see, of course, most people knew about the Deacons for Self-Defense in Louisiana. Huey Newton, the founder of the Black Panther Party, is also coming from Monroe, Louisiana, which was very recently in the news because of yet another police killing. I think that there's a piece that also has to do with people living in rural areas, fishing and hunting. When I interviewed people, and I think this, one of the interesting questions we might talk about is also Michael's discussion of methodology in his book. But as a historian who wanted to write a history of this radical movement, I didn't always find the sources that I needed in traditional archives. So I did lots and lots of oral history, and oral history that was almost like ethnography, where I was living in Oakland. And so I formed long-term relationships with people and spent a lot of time with them. And it's that kind of intimacy that made it possible to get a story that's outside a traditional archive. And people talked about, Bobby Seale in particular in his autobiography, hunting and fishing and growing up with that sense of autonomy, and that they carried that in many ways into the city. I've also seen the original rifles that were used by the Panthers. Many of them came from the Panthers family, and some of them went back to the late 19th century. So I think this is a history. Akinyele Umoja has written about armed self-defense in the South, but it is a much more common tradition than is known and has really only been written about, I'd say, in kind of academic histories over the last couple of decades. You can find a lot of this in people's autobiographies and mining the histories of organizations. So some people would argue that armed self-defense was a dominant mode in the Black South, but much less reported on and, of course, demonized.
Right, absolutely. Thank you. And that really, that whole discussion of the Panther symbol is, so powerful to think of it as essentially flowing from the South and from Lowndes County. Now, Mike, you have really written extensively about practices of militant interracial unionism. And one of the things that's so striking in your description of militant interracial unionism in the South and in Alabama specifically are the ways in which anti-racist activism was not a sidebar to what these unions did, but absolutely front and center. So maybe you could just share with our audience, just fill in that picture a little bit for us about interracial militant unionism in the South and in Alabama particularly.
So in Alabama, it really starts with the coal miners. The coal miners engaged in the late 19th century in organizing. They would be organized, they'd be defeated. There are 25,000, depending on the day and the number of people working, coal miners in Alabama, mostly in the five counties around Birmingham. So the northern part of Birmingham, as it is today, is the industrial part of the state. It's where coal, steel, various other industrial towns, Gadsden, Huntsville, and coal miners have found fairly early that if they didn't stick together, they would be defeated, that coal companies would bring in scabs from the other race. The National Coal Miners Union put in a provision that said anybody who joins the Ku Klux Klan is expelled from the union. So for whites, it was incompatible being a Klan member and being a union member. So even though the coal miners in most of the North, with the exception of West Virginia, which was a top coal mining state, and about 25% of the coal miners were African American, but in Pennsylvania, Illinois, they were white. They still supported this interracial solidarity on this level. And the solidarity of Alabama coal miners was very intense. They often took the lead. So, for example, in 1943, after a series of national strikes, Roosevelt got on the radio and said that the next coal miner who strike was going to be drafted into the army, and they were going to seize the mines. The next day, all 23,000 Alabama coal miners struck. And so they stimulated a general strike of coal miners in defiance of the government, which after 4 or 5 series of strikes in 1943, the government eventually capitulated and gave in to their demands. And you can see signs. I couldn't afford most of the pictures for my books, but one of the signs at some of the strikes in Alabama says you can't mine coal with bayonets. So this solidarity, and initially the Steelworkers Organizing Committee also pushed interracial issues, although they gave that up after the union was organized nationally. The mine, mill, and smelter workers, which actually had a big local in Bessemer, was a communist-led local, and Robin Kelly talks about that a lot in his book Hammer and Hoe, very civil rights oriented. So the mine, mill, and smelter workers and the coal miners union would send interracial groups of coal miners to register and vote, and some of the union locals would actually pay fees and get into arguments with registrars about literacy tests and that sort of thing. So the union, not always that successfully, but was fighting for getting black and white coal miners registered to vote. And the interesting thing is, an interesting thing is, but by the time coal miners also ended up trying to organize every other group of workers in the state. They supported washerwomen who went on strike in Birmingham, who were all going to be fired, and thousands of steel workers and coal miners came onto the picket lines and forced the victory for the strike. They organized woodworkers, textile workers, which were often difficult to organize in other parts of the South, were for a period of time all organized across Alabama. So with this high rate of unionization, they supported, for governor in 1946, a fellow named Big Jim Folsom, who I discuss a bit in my book. He wasn't, I won't call him a militant civil rights activist, but he was very different than most of the white supremacists in the South. He had interracial campaign rallies, shook hands with people. He claimed that racism was a tool by the bosses to divide workers. And he won election fairly convincingly in 46. In Alabama, you can't run for re-election, so he ran again in 54 and was elected. He opposed the opposition to Brown versus Board of Education and whatnot. And he had full union support across the state, which helped give him his majorities. So Alabama was interesting for a while. And of course, that all fell apart pretty soon we had George Wallace, who was originally a protege of Folsom's, but found he couldn't get elected without being overtly racist.
Thanks. I'm going to come back in a few minutes, Mike, and ask you about a few other of the kinds of campaigns around voter registration and anti-lynching and so on. But Donna, I wanted to also follow up because although our focus is on Alabama and Birmingham and Bessemer, you've already mentioned both the Deacons for Self-Defense in Louisiana and the fact that Huey P. Newton's family migrated from Louisiana to California. So could you say a little bit also about that southern route, if you will, of the Black Panther Party? Oh, yeah, we need you to unmute again, Donna.
Michael's book is helpful for understanding why Huey Newton was named after Huey Long. So it's one of the first things that he mentions in his autobiography, Revolutionary Suicide. And, you know, people talk about kind of the populism of the kingfish, but some of the concrete things that Long supported that meant that he had a lot of support and even admiration from some of the Black rural Southerners like Huey Newton's family. So he's born in Monroe, Louisiana, and then as a child, quite young child, the whole family migrates to the West Coast. And I wanted to say something about also how I discovered this story, and it's important because it speaks to questions of left and Marxist social research. You know, one of my favorite quotes from Marx is one that I've never heard anyone quote besides Michael Rogan. And it's, I'll just say it in English. Kant und Fichte like to fly in the air. There they're searching for another land. I, on the other hand, am only interested in what I see on the street. And the way that I found this story is that I was living in Oakland. And I saw that this place that I'd read about and seen described was very different, that you had a Black population at that time, this is the 1990s. It was largely, I'd say, third generation Southern migrants from the South, but many people identified as Southern. And because of the nature of chain migration, you had the transplantation of whole communities from especially Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, to a lesser extent, Arkansas, and some of those others like the, you know, South, not the Southwest, but that portion, kind of middle portion of the South. And when you spend time there, you see this very clearly, that it's what James Gregory called the Southern diaspora. And you have both white and Black Southern diasporas. And people had written about the Okie migrations, but in the West Coast, at the time I was working on this, there was actually very little written about it. And most of the things that had been written about it, and I actually started by writing a labor history about the shipyards, because it's the shipyards, it's that process of the segregation that you saw in the Gulf Coast, that the Western shipyards were also segregated, but there was successful organizing by C.L. Dellum's, Ron Dellum's uncle and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters that opened up the West Coast shipyards. And that was the magnet that literally pulled people from the South, especially from those like Gulf Coast areas. So one of the first things, in addition to observing this, I observed it in the 1990s, and I was trying to understand this whole Southern world and where it had come from. The other piece was noticing that Black communities in California, they literally ring shipyards like satellites. So you have Marin Ship that's up in Marin County. You have Oakland that ring the Kaiser shipyards. And then of course you have the concentration in Richmond. And then when you go down to the San Pedro Harbor, which is one of the largest shipyards, then you have Long Beach and all these historic Black communities. So that's what I would say, you know, the kind of genesis of thinking about Huey Newton's family, that they were not exceptional, they were representative. And Charles Johnson, who wrote The Negro War Worker on the edge of World War II for Gunnar Myrdal, he describes this pattern. And I was amazed at how much the Panthers, the children essentially of those shipyard migrants, how similar the families were to what he described. And just to set the stage for their larger story, this matters so much because it was a combination of opportunities in shipyards by federal employment with the passage also of the first FEPC, so the precedent in World War II of federal guaranteed fair employment, not denying people contracts if they violated FEPC, but using shaming tactics, but setting a culture that made it possible to organize. So the labor migration piece is really important. But the second piece is that in California, you didn't have a history of Jim Crow, official Jim Crow segregation in the school systems. You did have a history of Wong Crow, of statutes that were written against allowing Mexicans of Indian descent to attend schools. You still had de facto forms of segregation, but nevertheless, this was also a motivation for shipyard migrants because people could get access to high schools, where only a third of high schools in Louisiana were available, and only a third of Black communities had high schools that children could attend. And of course, they're migrating the post-World War II period, free access to higher education, which in my story is really the catalytic spark that the Panthers come from.
Yeah, I want to. So what I found, one thing particularly interesting to me in Donna's book is the migration patterns that she talks about where people came from Oakland, and they tended to be on the western part of the South. So in Detroit and Chicago, the migration took place much earlier. Steel mills, meat packing, start hiring lots of African Americans in the 20s. By the time you get to the 30s and 40s, you have a fairly high percentage unionized Black workforce. But people come from Alabama and Mississippi, not from the states as much as what, particularly Louisiana, that Donna talks about. And I was a community organizer in Newark at one point, and African Americans tended to come much more from North Carolina and South Carolina. Depends on how the railroads run. A lot of the blues, which I'm interested in the New York and Newark, come from North Carolina and South Carolina rather than Mississippi, which was a place centered from Chicago. But these things, so I worked in a plant which was about a large plant, was about a third African American, and many of the older African Americans were continually traveling back and forth between Alabama and Mississippi. Also things went the other way. So I don't have data on this, but I've read in some of the oral histories that many of the students involved in the first sit-ins in 1960, starting in Greensboro, had parents who were activists in the packing house workers. So the HBUs are primarily located in the South. And so in the more affluent unionized families, when Black children went to college, they came from places like Chicago and Detroit and went to the South, with the exception of a few. DC, maybe Howard wasn't quite the South, but certainly most of the Black colleges and universities were in the South. And so a lot of this activism took place from transplants. And I just have one interesting anecdote. So in the plant I worked in, we had a relatively large interracial radical group. And one of the guys in the group who I was close friends with, was sort of quiet. His mother did my taxes. And one day she takes me aside and she says, "You've got to do more education on my son." And I look at her, and I go, "What are you talking about?" She says, "I know where you're coming from. I was the secretary," and she names a mine mill local in Alabama that she had been active in. And so people who were active in unionized places in the South came north and brought those traditions with them, as well as the traditions in terms of armed self-defense. That I was a union official and I thought I was the only person on the assembly line who didn't have a gun on me in the plant. So this and this went for both Black and white and Latino workers, of which there were a lot of in the Chicago area. So this tradition that Donna talks about, as well as the unionized tradition from where people came from, and I just want to mention one thing in terms of Huey. So Louisiana is a complicated type of thing. There are parts with long-term unionization. People are familiar with the longshore and seamen and whatnot in New Orleans, but Baton Rouge has a tradition of Black and white woodworker unionization. The county that the Longs came from originally had voted, I don't know, 40% for Debs, and Long, to some extent, drew on this tradition. So I think that he's a complicated figure. He of course died and was assassinated in the 1935, 1936, but his family continued to control politics, and they integrated LSU in New Orleans, the first Southern non-Black university that was interracial, I think in 1958. So this is an interesting heritage, and it doesn't surprise me at all that Huey Newton's family would name them. He didn't go full bore and upgrade Blacks in all public service and government and whatnot, but he did a certain number of things that made African Americans think that feel sympathetic towards them. He also, Huey Long had an instance when the Ku Klux Klan was going to come and organize in the state. He said, if you arrive here, you'll go out with your toes facing up.
Could I add something? I wanted to respond to what we were saying also about the South. This matters so much because a lot of my book is about this, the richness and the genesis of what's thought of as this very future-looking Marxist movement is rooted actually in the rural South. But part of what produces that radicalism is how people in older generations of African Americans who had migrated earlier, because in California and most parts of the country and the world for that matter, there is a class division that has to do with migration. The people that migrate first are always the most affluent. It makes sense, right? And then migrants generally become poorer over time. And so people are bringing this rich political tradition from the South, but to be Southern was a class distinction among Black people and also in terms of white, the state social services. So you have this violent discourse of the culture of pathology, culture of poverty. And in California, it has a really strong inflection about Southerners. So it's about improper speech and illiteracy and the idea that even just the fact of being Southern is associated with being poorly educated, low class, today what we would call ratchet. And so that tension between that, so they're bringing this rich tradition and then they're actually experiencing a kind of another layer of discrimination. And it is the core terrain of class differentiation. So that goes back to the point that Michael made about my book. Like one of the reasons Oakland is so militant is that it is a Black working class city where there's a very small Black elite. And the reason for that historically is that it only had a 2% Black population in 1940. So the people that are coming in the second Great Migration are really coming from working class families and then from poor families. You never had this like strong middle class formation like you saw in many larger cities, including Los Angeles.
Donna, that's really fascinating, and it moves us perfectly into the next question I was going to ask each of you. Your emphasis now on these class distinctions, because one of the things Michael mentioned, Robin Kelly's book Hammer and Hoe earlier, and one of the things that I find so interesting, both in that book and also in a sort of a companion essay that Robin produces on Birmingham in Race Rebels, is he's very insistent on this distinction that working class Black people in Alabama and in Birmingham in particular were full of suspicion towards respectability politics. When it was the communists who launched the campaign to defend the Scottsboro Boys, this did not bother them. And they, in fact, the NAACP in Birmingham was having much more trouble building a mass base than at the time the communists and their defense organization, the International Labor Defense Front, was having. So maybe let's stay with this theme a little bit, because it's going to bring us back ultimately to union organizing and Amazon and so on in Birmingham. That, contrary to what a lot of people have tended to believe, in fact, there has been this much more kind of durable, tough, working class Black radicalism throughout the South. And I think that speaks both to union issues and to the ways in which Black power develops. So I don't know which one of you wants to start us off on that one, but the whole issue of really, the very distinctive Black working class kinds of traditions and cultures of resistance.
I can start. I just say I have to start actually on a very plaintive note, because I wrote this book as a dissertation from roughly 1999 through about 2004, including my coursework. And I knew when I was writing it that the world that I was writing about was disappearing, because this was Oakland in the shadow of Silicon Valley and the tech boom, and seeing just the violence of so much wealth flowing into Oakland. So like the world that I'm going to describe was absolutely still visible to me in late 1990s, but it is gone now. The Oakland's Black population has gone down to 20%. And that is a testament to no-fault evictions and the enormous wealth coming from Silicon Valley. So all these things in some ways are interconnected. But Oakland in the 90s was still a very working class and very affordable Black community. We all used to joke at the time when Jerry Brown became mayor, he went on this campaign on 60 Minutes and talked about, how he was going to change Oakland. But our attitude was always, tell everyone it's very dangerous here. Don't come, whatever you do, there's lots of crime. And we'd say that because we knew the danger of gentrification. So I just have to start with that before I go back in history. So one of the ways, an index of the kind of militant, like Black working class culture in the Panthers is that, the Panthers had a newspaper that they published from 1967 to 1980. The party doesn't disband until 1982. But in that newspaper, they had a section of it called the Bootlickers Gallery. So the Panthers are very famous for calling the police pigs, and most of us know that story. And it's actually a very interesting story also about how they arrived at that. But it's because that's also related to the rural South, about choosing a way to delegitimize law enforcement that would be really legible and tangible for rural populations. They also wanted a non-racial imagery for the police. So that mattered too, because they were making solidarity with the anti-war protesters and the radical anti-imperialist left, the mother country left, as Eldridge Cleaver called them. But in addition to that, they had something called the Bootlickers Gallery. And in that Bootlickers Gallery was top of the list, Roy Wilkins, head of the NAACP. Why did they hate him? One, because they saw him as a class enemy, but most importantly, because of his role in supporting the Vietnam War. Thurgood Marshall, also in the Bootlickers Gallery, because they were very hard on liberal Democrats because of their failure to fight anti-communism. So even that sensibility, it's political, but it's also a working class sensibility, like even calling it the Bootlickers Gallery. And that you see throughout the Panthers, the style, the choice of armed self-defense. And I think, in thinking about respectability politics, what they didn't like were they were so focused on imperialism and US foreign policy abroad that led them into conflict with almost all of the Black Democrats of the era. Their closest ally was Ron Dellums. And I found a wonderful picture in the Panther archive. It stood out to me the most, that Ron Dellums had sent to Huey Newton, and I found in Huey Newton's files, and it was Ron Dellums with his family making a peace sign because of that connection through the anti-war movement. So Dellums is someone they liked, but almost all the other Black representatives they dragged through the mud. So that matters. I would go even deeper than respectability politics. You know, there was a real fight over not being satisfied with incorporation into the Democratic Party and really giving foreign policy. Their attack on Cold War liberalism was a very serious one, but they did it with a lot of working class style and humor, hence the bootlickers gallery.
Yeah, that's great.
So, yeah, I think the history of the civil rights movement that we normally get makes it appear like there was a unified African-American community. But in some of the cities that I've studied, the class, and this starts with Birmingham, whereas the Black miners had not so much with the street flair, but a very antagonistic view towards many of the Black elite in Birmingham. One other city that I've looked at is in Memphis, where the Black elite was originally excluded from the ruling circles. And so in the sanitation strike in 1968, which King supported, the community was unified. But after that struggle, Black elites were incorporated into the ruling strata of the city. And 2 years later, when a hospital strike took place, which was overwhelmingly African-American workers at the hospital, they opposed the strike. Same thing happened in Atlanta with a sanitation strike when Mayor Jackson was mayor. He was supposed to be very liberal. He opposed the strike. So, and this takes us back to the Amazon campaign. So in looking at the demographics of Bessemer, so Bessemer is a city with 72%, at least the data that I saw, African-American. The elected officials are African-American. It was a city that had been abandoned industrially. And so the city leaders were very anxious to get the Amazon fulfillment center into the city. Like all cities, they made their concessions. Much of the frontline management was African-American. So it's not just the workforce. So this is very different than, Detroit in 1969, 1970 with Drum, where you had an all-white management, racist management with an overwhelmingly Black workforce. So one of the things that I saw going on in Detroit in connection with activities of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, they did a lot of things to force Black elites who were not sympathetic initially to Black workers' struggles, force them to take positions and come out in defense. So, and so when the police repression came down on them, and also initially that they forced Black politicians to come out and stand with them on the lines. And this takes a lot of work to mobilize these people because their proclivities are to stand with the people who they're tied to in the power structure. And it seems to me that one of the things that, and I was not down in Bessemer during, although I've talked to people who were and a few people who were active in the campaign, it didn't seem to me that the union did enough of that in terms of mobilizing and neutralizing the people, the Black elected officials and Black elected and Black management. And there's an interesting campaign, and I've got, maybe I won't get it up on the slide, but in Mississippi, catfish farms, catfish started out, at least when I was young, as a sort of junk garbage food because they ate garbage from the bottom of streams, and eventually became a delicacy, and they were all grown in farms. And most of these catfish farms were in Mississippi. some with as many as 1,000 workers, predominantly African American. And they were pretty much all organized in the late 1980s. And the people doing the organized mobilized the communities and forced the politicians, some of whom were compromised in their relationships with the catfish farm owners, forced them to publicly come out in favor of unionization and to appear at their rallies. They really put their feet to the fire. And this helped them mobilize the whole community in support. So they had active community support as well as support from the workers. And I think one of the questions that one would raise in Bessemer, here's an area that has something of a radical history. You go to Birmingham and you see the Civil Rights Museum and the park across from City Hall with the statues of dogs chasing. I mean, it's a very militant civil rights area, but didn't seem to me that that the campaign drew enough on this and forced politicians, elites, and mobilized the community as a whole in support, as it seems to me was done in, like I said, the catfish or workers or earlier campaigns. So that's certainly one of the things that they might have done. And in many of these campaigns in the 30s and 40s, the votes in favor of union are somewhat incredible. 500 to 2 in favor of the union. So what was done then and what wasn't being done seems to be as a possibility. And let me just say as an aside, this is a very difficult time to be mobilizing people to vote for unions. Not the least of which is the pandemic, which makes it difficult. People are worried about unemployment. The labor movement is weak, and it doesn't look like there's going to be a lot of support with 6% unionization in the private sector. So not a lot of big strikes going on, et cetera. But even given that, it seems to me more could have been done to mobilize support.
Great, thanks, Mike. I'm just going to interject quickly. Mike mentioned the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit. For those of you who want to get up to speed on the League, there's a wonderful book, Detroit, I Do Mind Dying. And activists with the League also produced their own documentary film called Finally Got the News, which is available on YouTube. I also noticed that my University of Houston history colleague, Josiah Rector, is here in our meeting today. And Josiah is somebody who works on Detroit and mobilizations against environmental racism and so on. So Josiah or others, if you want to throw anything into the chat, we'll maybe in about 15 minutes or so be turning to chat questions, comments, and the like. But for the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, which, as Mike says, is a really interesting phenomenon in Detroit. Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, and Finally Got the News are really exceptional, both of them. Now we are talking a lot about Alabama and Birmingham. And I'm interested, Donna, also in the role of Black women in all of this. Both the patterns of migration, but also their role in Black Power movements and so on. And of course, one of our most celebrated living figures in the Black radical tradition, Angela Davis, comes from Birmingham. So, could you just share a few thoughts and reflections for us around the gender dimension in terms of the development of Black Power and the Black Panther Party?
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, since we've been kind of linking labor to thinking about the longer trajectory, the fight to get access to the shipyards, women played an absolutely crucial role in it. And when I was using the archives, the Fair Employment Archives in San Francisco and San Bruno, it was interesting. I was going to look for all the complaints about the shipyards. And what I found were overwhelmingly complaints written by white collar workers and by women, talking about job discrimination, being invited to come for a civil service exam. And then when they would show up, being told that it was no longer happening, writing about their sons going off to war and their own inability to get employment. So from the very beginning in the Second Great Migration, women played a really important role in the fight for fair employment. And of course, although we have the iconography of Rosie the Riveter as kind of a white woman flexing her arm like this, when you go and look at the Richmond shipyards, they were majority Black. And they've done beautiful public history and public memory in Richmond. I went to look at the memorials that were built, which were informed by doing oral history. And thinking about women in the Black Power movement, this history is still being written. So we have a really important book by Rhonda Williams, who wrote a book called Concrete Demands, which is a kind of national synthetic history about women in the Black Power movement, and takes it back. It's part of a literature also that's an important complement to the things we've been talking about, is the history of the Northern Civil Rights Movement, which is a lot of the prehistory of the Black Power movement. And many of the figures, not unlike SNCC, like the life of Stokely Carmichael and the life of Kwame Ture, many of the people who become important in the Black Power movement had also been involved in the Northern Civil Rights Movement. So in my book, women become important really throughout the book, but I trace some figures that are not nearly as well known that I discovered through doing oral history about becoming active in the Afro-American Association. So one thing I haven't talked about is that higher education was the catalytic place where you have Southern migrants coming out of the South, but then suddenly having this enormous access to education. And this is a really important and resonant point, and it's very empirical. I found it, I wasn't looking for it. And I found that just all roads led to Merritt College and to the campuses. And it was really this phenomena of having working class people whose parents had 5 or 6 years of education suddenly have almost unlimited access to free higher education. So women played an important role in the study group. And one of the women who really told me the history of the Afro-American Association was another Southern migrant from Louisiana, named Ann Williams. Something that stands out about the Panthers is that you had women present from the very beginning, that the police patrols were all male, but they are really only in effect for about 6 months. But when you had the March in Sacramento, which was an attempt to prevent the overturning of the law that made carrying loaded unconcealed weapons legal, you had 19 people that marched on Sacramento and 5 of them were women. So you did have women involved in armed self-defense, but women, like men, have a spectrum of personality and different political profiles. So there were some women who were interested in the kind of revolutionary iconography. If you go look at the kind of the art of the Black Panther Party, which is very important to how it recruited people, you'll see a lot of images that are taken from anti-colonial images of fights in Tanzania and in Cuba, of essentially the iconography of a woman holding a baby and carrying a gun. Very, very common image. So getting that kind of the nurturance of the next generation combined with fighting armed struggle for state socialism or anti-imperial struggle. So that was a part of the iconography of the party. But in general, I would say that by 1960, the end of 1967, 1968, almost all of the male leadership was incarcerated. And the Panther Party essentially hits the wall. They face so much repression that there's a moment of re-examination. And it's at this point that they consider a new turn from openly embracing armed struggle and using police patrols and the gathering of weapons, and they turn to something called survival pending revolution. And that begins in 1968. It's not an accident that this coincides with a gender shift in the membership. The thing about the Panther Party, despite the way it's reported about and how the FBI saw it, it was a very small group of people. For the first year of the organization, most of these were people that Huey knew personally. These were literally like teenagers and people in their early 20s from high school and community college who joined this organization. they talked about recruiting brothers off the block, and a lot of them had been incarcerated for really minor offenses, juvenile delinquency, things like that. But a lot of them were actually childhood friends, and he recruited the people he knew, as do most organizers initially. But by 68, they are getting a lot of press coverage. They are being covered all over the country. People are founding their own organizations. And as they pivot towards this thing called survival pending revolution, this is when you have the founding of the liberation schools and the setting up of the first breakfast programs. So it's a change in the demographics of who's participating. And then in turn, as they change the kind of organizing they're doing, they attract more and more women. So Bobby Seale argues that after 68, the party was majority women. Something important about that is that the Panthers, people talk a lot about the sexism and misogyny in the Panther Party, and there certainly was in the Panthers, as there were in many of the 1960s organizations. But one thing that sets the party apart is that you actually had a woman head of the party from 1974 to 1977, Elaine Brown. And you had Kathleen Cleaver, who was Eldridge Cleaver's wife, who sat on the Central Committee. And my argument in my book is that most of the things that Eldridge Cleaver is known for, apart from his media persona, which I think is incredibly toxic and destructive for many, many reasons. But his organizing in the party, a lot of that, I think there's a lot of evidence that it was done by Kathleen Cleaver. So you do have powerful women in the party. Like many socialist and Marxist movements, I think they become places of struggle over gender. So you have, activist Panther women who are important, but there was violence against women. Many of the women who rose through the ranks of the party were often affiliated with powerful men, either as wives or partners, so that mattered. But I think when you go back and you look at the history of the party, there was a real bias in the media towards focusing on the most sensational aspects of the Panthers: guns, Soul on Ice, Eldridge Cleaver. But the longest running institution of the party was a K-12 school called the Huey P. Newton Intercommunal Institute that was always run by a woman and staffed by women. And it was the longest running institution of the party. So women were incredibly important in the longevity of the party. And the argument of my book is that the Panthers' real legacy is political education, be that through the newspaper, be that through the K-12 school, be that they used police patrols as a form of education. They didn't just carry guns, they carried guns, and then they read from the Declaration of Independence and the California Statute of Laws. So everything that they did, including an electoral campaign that they ran in 1972, was seen as an opportunity for education. So I'd say women's role in the longest running institution of the party shows how central they were to the party.
Wonderful, thank you.
So I think one of the refreshing and really positive things about the current period, and particularly Black Lives Matter, is the prominent role of women in leadership, and it's acknowledged. I mean, one of the things that I look at both in the labor movement and the left, things in the 30s and 40s. So in the unemployed movement, in almost every place, but certainly in Birmingham, in Scranton, Pennsylvania, the dominant activists are women, but it's almost always ceded for men to be in leadership positions. That takes place, as it's fairly well known, in the civil rights movement in terms of the 60s. That's even when women did a lot of the organizing, that was the case in left-wing unions as well, with a few notable exceptions in some leadership positions. So I think that whole with women doing a lot of the work but not taking as much of the public leadership role seems to be, at least to some extent, changed dramatically in the past recent period. I don't know if that rings true to you too, in looking at those things too, Donna.
It does, definitely.
And Mike, I said we would come back to this point, so let me give you a chance to elaborate on it. In your book, you describe very militant interracial unions in Alabama and other parts of the South. You mentioned already, you can't be a member if you join the Klan. But you also describe white and Black union activists organizing anti-lynching campaigns to desegregate restaurants, voter registration campaigns, and so on. What's so striking to a reader who's much more familiar with unions that are based 95 to 99% simply around collective bargaining with the employer is you're describing a kind of militant civil rights or social justice unionism for which and for whom fighting racism is as central an issue as fighting for higher wages. So could you just share with us, one or two examples of those sorts of things?
Sure. And I think there's some important, one of which is in the area that Donna has done research on, in particular, Local 10 of the Longshoremen's Union based in San Francisco, started off majority white. It was left-wing, primarily communist-led, and they fought for hiring and upgrading of Black longshoremen. They led the campaign after World War II to get bus drivers in San Francisco, African-American bus drivers hired. They were originally all white, as it was in most big cities in the country. And when these bus drivers were attacked, the union sent 4 or 5 longshoremen to ride with them on the buses to defend them, which ended the attacks. Another particularly interesting example of the farm equipment workers, most of their locals were very militant around civil rights issues. And one thing that Tony Gilpin writes about in her book is the Louisville local, the farm equipment workers, which had 6,000 members at one point. So they not only integrated the jobs and the locker rooms and lunch rooms in the plant, and this was a local that was at most never more than 15% African American. They would take hundreds of workers, interracial groups, and they integrated hotels, parks, swimming pools in the Louisville area. And that was part of what was central to the union as a whole. And in contrast, the foundry, which was at least 50% Black, which was organized later by the UAW during the McCarthy period, so the FE didn't really have a chance to organize it, never integrated the plant and never engaged in any civil rights activity. So this is sort of a damning statement about the Reuther-led UAW after the left was expelled during the McCarthy period. And we can look at incidents like this that took place across the South and in other places. I'll give you one other example from Detroit, which is sort of interesting. So after World War II, the auto workers there were 400,000 auto workers in Detroit itself, 25 to 30% of whom were African American. Detroit was had the highest percentage of Black home ownership and the highest average income of any city in the country because they were unionized auto workers. All the restaurants and bars around auto plants, however, were segregated. So the NAACP and the UAW sent letters to all the restaurants around telling them that they had to integrate. Of course, nobody listened to them. And the left-wing locals that they organized and they set up picket lines around the bars and restaurants, and they told the owners that unless they integrated, they would not have any more business. And they quickly integrated all the restaurants and bars around left-wing locals in the Detroit area. So this fits into what Donna's talking about why some of these people are put on the wall. What's the name of the wall?
Oh, the Bootlickers Gallery.
The Bootlickers Gallery. So there was a lot of cynicism toward the national NAACP and towards the national leadership of the union among workers, but particularly among Black workers, because they didn't see anything coming out of that. And that was one of the things that the League of Revolutionary Black Workers drew upon, that the ineffectiveness of so-called liberal pro-civil rights leadership, whether in the union or the NAACP, to effectively bring about change. And by the time that the McCarthy period happened and the Cold War took place, these forces were weak and not enough to change the labor movement and society as a whole. But I argue that if they had been, if this had been more extensive, then things might have turned out differently.
Great. And this takes us, really nicely, I think, back into the discussion of the current moment and the current conjuncture, because Donna, you've written recently also about the role of women of color in rebuilding the labor movement in the United States, for instance. And one of the themes that's really coming out of our discussion is the need for unions to become rooted in working class multiracial communities, as opposed to, just appearing with an organizing drive and hoping that that model, which has not been working now for a very long time, will work. Whereas you highlight, for instance, the Chicago teachers and the Los Angeles teachers and so on. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, drawing on the conversation we're having, about your own thinking in terms of what kind of working class organizing might offer some prospects of hope in this period.
Yes, thank you for that question. And here I have to take off my academic hat and put on my labor organizer hat, because it's absolutely in the context that my piece for The Guardian was written. So I'm a middle-aged labor activist who started doing it, I'd say about 10 years after I got tenure, my late 40s. And Rutgers right now, because I have to contextualize it, like even how that piece came to be. So Rutgers has a wonderful, there's no other way to call it, left-led union right now. And during the pandemic, a coalition of 19 different unions came together covering 20,000 workers in New Jersey, where you have New Brunswick, Newark, and Camden. So, Rutgers is located in these kinds of post-industrial cities, like the one that I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania. And so we're seeing this very exciting moment of labor organizing in which the faculty, tenured faculty, and non-tenured faculty, part-time faculty, and graduate students are forming coalition with all the different unions, everything from the medical interns to dining hall and custodial workers who are laid off in huge numbers. Rutgers laid off 5% of its workforce in the past year. And so the piece that I wrote about Amazon was really my attempt to also cover what our union is doing. And I have to say that there's a huge barrier that we face. And this is important to me to also how to understand what happened in Bessemer, which is that the mainstream media won't cover labor. I'm the head of the media committee. And so I spent all of last year trying to place op-eds about labor struggles in New Jersey. Very, very difficult. So I think that the way that Amazon was even framed was like, this is the test of the labor movement. The labor movement will rise and fall with Amazon. The problem is that they're not covering these other struggles, like the one that Michael mentioned of the coal miners in very close to Bessemer. They also weren't covering Rutgers. Rutgers has won these enormous victories, including a memorandum of understanding in which 20,000 workers came together and prevented the central administration from firing any more workers, and many other things as well. So I just wanted to frame that, because my writing about the Chicago Teachers Union is really autobiographical, not just of me as a person, but our whole union, because we are looking to really, I'd say the last 10 years, very influenced by Jane McElvey, who in turn goes back to the tradition of communist CIO organizing, the kind of organizing that she's advocating for, the face-to-face conversations, the direct organizing, the fighting in public rather than accepting a secret NLRB election. These are kind of the principles that have influenced our union. And I would say that a lot of the inspiration we draw is from Karen Lewis of the Chicago Teachers Union, Stacey Davis Gates, who I interviewed about my piece. And Stacey Davis Gates also gave me an analysis about what happened in Bessemer. And one of her questions was, how many organizers from the community were involved? How many, Black organizers coming from Bessemer, and that importance of rooting yourself in community. And that's something we're engaged in at Rutgers, about how to do real bargaining for the common good, to make real connections with the communities, not just to invoke them, but to form real relationships and also try to build leadership, which is, Michael makes this point in his book, and I think it's crucial. It's what I've learned in my 3 years as a labor organizer, which is the building of leadership is so important. So I think that, the vanguard of the labor movement is our airline workers and nurses and teachers and public sector employment, which just try to get an article into the New York Times about a public sector labor struggle. So I hope that answers the question, but I wanted to say that. I wanted to write about Amazon to say Amazon is not the only game in town. Amazon matters. We need to actually put a mirror up to the mainstream media and say, we need more coverage of labor, rather than just swooping in, covering one single campaign and placing the entire weight of labor's future on it.
Great.
So,
Michael.
Yeah. So one thing I'd like to add, so if you look at the struggles during the 1930s and 1940s, mainstream unions tend to come in, try to organize, they leaflet, they sign people up. I was in the member of the UAW for 10 years, and the sort of disaster, and they continue to get worse and worse. Try to make nice to the company, say they're going to cooperate, hand out leaflets, they lose an election, and then they leave. And the more successful campaigns led by the left were, if they were defeated in a strike or an election, they didn't leave. The group kept organizing, the people on the outside and the inside kept organizing, and sometimes they eventually won by doing that. And the unions that kept coming back after leaving and having no presence almost always failed when they came back again. They'd collected signatures, sometimes they'd even collected dues from people and then taken off and come back, and workers got very cynical about them. So I think it's not just the community, but inside the workplace, people have to be consistent and take a long-term view of what they're doing. And as I also argue, most union organizing takes place in big waves, but you have to be ready for when the wave comes. So it seems like there's a wave of teacher organizing that's been taking place. I've got pictures of some of the struggles. The 3,000 Oklahoma teachers occupying the state capitol building, West Virginia. So these are places that don't have sympathetic, not that any of them are sympathetic, but they're in Republican states where the budgets have been cut more extremely than in other states. Teachers' situations is even more disastrous. So teachers seem to be solidaristic this time, and other constituencies, and Amazon and people in the logistic sector in particular have a lot more leverage over people in individual workplaces. So if they're eventually organized, it's going to be taken by storm, either with more militant tactics or broad-based organizing and strikes. So we'll see what happens. But it's the long-term organizing and building these type of bases that are really central to what's going on, or to the future, I should say.
And for those of you who haven't yet had a chance to see Mike's book, he has a very extensive discussion of associational power in these terms. That is to say, working class organizing that is not confined to the workplace, as important as it is to be rooted in the workplace, but is based on mobilizing working class communities, building roots among all the working class allies that can be brought into struggle and organizing alongside workers who are trying to win union rights. So the two questions that came up in the chat, I want to throw out, because they overlap, I'm going to throw out for both of you. Philip said that the senility of American liberalism is its failure to stand up to anti-communism. And Josiah has picked up on a recent comment by Charisse Burden-Stelly, who has used the term intellectual McCarthyism to describe the marginalization of African-American communists and other anti-capitalist radicals in more liberal and mainstream narratives of US history and the labor movement and so on. And really would like both of you to speak to the question of the importance of standing up against the attempts to marginalize and dismiss these radical histories. And maybe I'll ask you to say a word or two about why this actually matters today for us. So Donna, let's start with you.
Okay, so to answer the first question, I think I might word it a little bit differently. And I would say that our dominant tradition is anti-communist liberalism in the 20th century. It's not just that liberalism isn't standing up against it, that, you know, like some of my mentors, I think the consensus school, which, you know, talked about, you know, at the height of the Cold War, that essentially Cold War liberalism was unopposed in the world. It was a triumphalist narrative. And while I would disagree with that, I think there's an element that's true. The depth of Cold War liberalism, it still exists post-Cold War. And my general view is that the Cold War has actually not stopped. This idea that because the Soviet Union fell apart, that the Cold War stopped. But if you're talking about Black people and traditions of third world Marxism that I come from, much of the fight was not East-West, it was North-South. And it was the East-West informing the North-South, right? So of course we know the Cold War did not stop in 1989. We still have terrible battles of repression of the left, killing of labor organizers, killing of environmental activists, dispossession of land and communities. So we're still having those kinds of battles. So unfortunately, I think that anti-communism is the core of what the United States is. We have to be honest about that. I spend time in different parts of the world, and one of my favorite places to go is north of Ireland for a series of reasons. And trying to talk to them just about the scale of anti-communism in the US. You know, the US is the great global anti-communist hegemon that has, you know, been fighting communists all over the world and internally repressing its own left. So, and that relationship between anti-communism, of course, and white supremacy, and the way that communism was understood in the South as interracial sex and interracialism. So it's just the dominant tradition. So I wouldn't say that liberalism has failed in fighting it. I'd say the constitution of American liberalism is deeply anti-communist. The second question, intellectual McCarthyism, I guess I answered that really. My thing is, I'm writing a book now on the Cold War, and I've written about a lot of other things about the drug war. And a part of it is about Central America. It's the convergence between telling the domestic history of the drug war in Los Angeles, but how anti-communist foreign policy helped to produce the crack crisis itself. And talking to the intellectuals that were writing about Central America in the 80s and 90s, one in particular, who's this brilliant radical who was an older Panther ally, who actually knew the Hollywood 10 and had these like circles of communists in Los Angeles. And he told me about how he essentially was more or less blacklisted. He made his money by writing popular books. He wrote a book about the Sandinistas and the wars in Nicaragua during the Reagan period. And he was blacklisted by his publisher and became a playwright, which is how he went on to support himself. So what I would say is the kind of anti-communist purges, there's actually a problem with even calling it McCarthyism, because as in Michael's book, talking about the importance of anti-communism in the 30s, prior to the onslaught of the Cold War. And we can take that much, much further back in American history. I think it is the great continuity, unfortunately.
And Mike, maybe in your response, you can also link in the question of how central anti-communism and anti-labor was to the Klan.
Well, I would like to get back to liberalism, because I don't think there is any opposition. And I agree with Donna. So there's a book by Nick Fisher that argues that so-called liberal anti-communism is objectively no different than the fascist type of anti-communism. And that people who think of themselves as liberals who try to embrace this end up shooting themselves in the foot. So I've studied the loyalty tests, and the most common indication when they did the loyalty tests in the government in the late 40s of whether you were communist was whether you had people of the opposite race over to your house. So it's inherently racist. And the NAACP got caught in this trap. They thought that they could make themselves appear more loyal. They attacked Paul Robeson. They attacked Du Bois quite a bit, and then they had members in the post office who were getting fired, and they complained. And the reason they were getting fired is because they were involved in interracial activities. So nothing that they did to distinguish themselves worked. The same thing happened during Operation Dixie, which I talk to an extent in the book. In order to distinguish themselves and claim that they weren't communists and the left, they hired almost all white male organizers. This is the 1946 campaign to organize the South. These are inexperienced white male veterans. They were still attacked as communists. So it really didn't help them any. And all they did is cut themselves off from the more militant, radical organizers and elements in the community. So I think that there's no question that liberals embraced anti-communism as part of their DNA. And one has to be on guard all the time about that happening. And the interesting thing is that anti-communism has never been as effective within the Black community. So you have people, so Harold Washington had been an organizer for the communist-led labor organization. Coleman Young had that background. And none of that helped hurt them politically within their African-American districts, the way that sort of taint hurt people among whites. So I think that's an interesting aspect, but it's also something on principle that needs to be combated. And interesting, Walter Reuther, when he was more radical before he became quite more conservative, fought and opposed anti-communism. He said it was inherently anti-labor. And of course, he changed his tune by the early 1940s.
Excellent. We're counting down now. We've gone a little over an hour and a half, so I just want to remind everyone, if you haven't yet had a chance, you need to check out Donna Murch's book, Living for the City, Migration, Education, and the Rise of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. and Michael Goldfield's The Southern Key, Class, Race, and Radicalism in the 1930s and 40s. And I think, Donna and Mike, I'll just really, before I do the kind of final outtake and hand back to Philip, really just ask you for any final thoughts on both the legacies of Black and labor radicalism in the US South and the prospects for their revival, always, of course, in new forms, new historical configurations, and so on, but living through this moment of both Black Lives Matter insurgency and, at the moment, pro-Palestinian insurgency, and seeing young people who are taking to the streets in anti-racist and anti-colonial mobilizations. I certainly come away with a sense that the traditions that you've been describing are by no means simply historical relics for study, but that they might in fact speak to a future generation. So any thoughts on that, Donna?
Yes, thank you. And David, thank you for being such a wonderful moderator and asking us such thoughtful and provocative questions. I think that one of the reasons I've decided to become active, not just a union member, but to become active as a department rep, equivalent to a shop steward, and later become part of the executive council, and in the future develop and get another position, is that I think that the economic fight is crucial. And I really don't see the extreme polarization of wealth that we have in the United States. I do not see a way to fight this other than unions. I've been very active in the kind of anti-carceral movement that even predates BLM, different kinds of organizing against the death penalty and kind of the entire infrastructure of punishment and incarceration that we have in the United States. And while I think not-for-profit organizations do important work, I really think that we need a revived labor movement, period. And that's why I became involved in it, because I think that you have this twin fight right now, the fight against state violence in the military. And I think that, a really robust anti-military mobilization is desperately needed. I think everyone has fallen into depression since the Second Gulf War, and also the failures of the Obama administration to substantively change foreign policy. But I think that those three terms, the fight against US militarism and the core of what our state actually, our tax money goes for, is our giant foreign policy apparatus, the labor movement, and then this fight against immigrant detention, incarceration, and the larger kind of infrastructure that goes along with that. I feel hopeful about the labor movement, but that has a lot to do with my own vantage point of seeing the possibilities of struggle in New Jersey. And I think some of these tensions between also the left and liberals, it's still very much a part of the labor movement today, how people understand how to organize, who to organize, the fight over a kind of social justice unionism that has these deep resonances. So one of the reasons I was excited to read Michael's book is to go back to the 1930s and 40s, because I see in some ways we are looking for lessons, including concrete organizing lessons for today. But I think that the labor movement, I've written about many different parts of the left and from different kinds of vantage points. But at the moment, I'm focused on the labor movement because I think that this is what we need. We need a core organization. Everyone, if they are not independently wealthy, has to work. Some people work in the informal economy, some people work in the formal economy. And so the possibilities of workplace organization are so essential to forms of all organization for the left. And I say that as someone who wrote a book on the Panthers, who are not at all centered in labor. So I do see possibilities. What I really want to see is what I wrote about in my Guardian piece, is the wedding of the Black Lives Matter movement and the fight against racial capitalism, wedding that with the labor movement. And of course, this fight against US militarism.
Thank you. Michael.
Yeah, so trajectories of labor movements tend to go through big highs and big lows. This takes place internationally. We're at a low point now, but the industrialization of the United States and the economic development, particularly in the South, is fairly extensive. Also, one never knows when things are going to break through. Billie Holiday in her autobiography says people don't know when they've had enough until they've had more than enough. And it may be that we're getting to more than enough. But if we look at Alabama is a rapidly industrializing state. So it's not just so Amazon is not the only one who has a big logistics center in Alabama. FedEx, Lowe's, and Carvana have big warehouse centers near Birmingham. Tuscaloosa, which is not that far away, has a Mercedes-Benz plant with thousands of workers in it. We know about the poultry workers that RWDSU is organized, but and coal miners. But Alabama is becoming a center for auto parts production. So there are 3 or 4 southern states where there are corridors along the major highways there were parts production. And at some point, more of these people are going to organize. Amazon's a tough nut to crack because it's got 1 million employees. It's got a worldwide operation, 1 million employees in the United States, worldwide operation, and they're very draconian in terms of how they treat their workers. So it may be that things will start out in some of these smaller places, or it may be that things will sweep through Amazon. And I look at Amazon in some ways like the steel industry was in the early 1930s. Coal miners are in smaller units, smaller companies, and were easier, not easy, but easier to organize. Steel workers didn't organize until there were massive upsurges of tens of thousands of steel workers. Miners came marching in, often armed, to help them have peaceful rallies. So Amazon in some ways is like the steel industry was in the 1930s. Very large companies, huge amount of control and repression. So it's going to take a different type of upsurge to organize them than it would take to organize a chicken processing plant, which have been successfully organized in parts of Alabama. But I think the prospect, and this is sort of a law of nature, a law of capitalism, that workers, as they get concentrated in big places and conditions get worse, eventually organize.
Thank you. I see that our host, Philip, is going to come in before I do the final thanks with a quick question, and then I'll come back in, and then I'll hand it back to Philip.
Well, I wanted to pose a question along the lines of Donna's 3 axes for the movement to go to following the Black Lives Matter, following labor organizing, and anti-imperialism. And it's the last that I have a question about, and I just wonder about, which is that obviously it was a big thing in the 60s and 70s. I mean, so that's where I come out of. You know, I was in Chile and a part of the Central American movement. And in fact, at the time, not very conscious of labor, except hard hats who were doing, pro-war demonstrations on Wall Street and so forth in New York. But the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, seemed to have revived in a really strong way the basis of a kind of anti-imperialist movement in the US, particularly after Abu Ghraib and something like that. And was it just that Obama came in and everybody said, oh, Obama's there, we're fine here, we'll turn it over to him and we'll think about other things? I mean, what happened that it seems to have died down? It's not a thing that even people who are, into sort of labor struggles, some kind of labor struggles. I mean, or work struggles even, are not as obsessed about it and the fact that these wars keep going on and on, that they're not the basis of the kind of mobilizations that they were. I just want everybody's sort of opinion of why, how that happened, and how you think it might change, or it could change, when we pretty much seem to have the ability to fight wars with very few troops and with a lot of predator drones or whatever, you know, just wreaking havoc everywhere, but not having the body bags come back the way they did in Vietnam.
Okay, thanks, Philip. So Donna and Mike, a final thought on where's anti-imperialism and how do we rebuild it?
I have a lot of thoughts about this because I come of age under Reagan in a very conservative, that I call Trump before Trump, white working class community. It's a very small Black population. And I've very much come out of that anti-imperialist left, even though I'm younger than most. But my real mentors were Caribbean leftists, including Decimal Williams, who was the ambassador from Grenada to the UN, who went after the US invaded Grenada, she was stripped of her citizenship. They took her passport, took her entire archive, and then basically kept her prisoner in the United States. And that is where she taught me at Williams College in that moment. So I was really trained by third world leftists coming from mainly women from Jamaica, Grenada, Argentina. So my entry into the left came from not so much from the US left as it came from people in Latin America and the Caribbean. So it's very close to my heart. It's probably the reason I became a historian. It's a longer discussion, but I really do feel that the second Gulf War was definitive, because I was living in the Bay Area when we had the largest protests in history. Now our largest protests in history are the BLM protests from the past year, with between 15 and 26 million saying they participated in a Black Lives Matter protest. But in 2003, it was those anti-war demonstrations. And I think that the defeat was so definitive, and more it's become this kind of hopelessness that we feel as if we have so little power to affect foreign policy. And so there was that moment. And in the university at that time, I was at Berkeley, there was, Negri, what was the book on anti-imperialism? It was Empire, exactly. I mean, they were all the rage. I personally felt they weren't grounded enough. It was very kind of theory oriented. I prefer more like kind of straightforward, very clear writing, but it was trendy and everyone was talking about it. And there was this kind of, in the university, it had a lot of intellectual cachet that related to the mass protest and organizing. And then after the second Gulf War, the devastation that we all experienced, I was teaching when that happened. I was teaching a class on the long 60s, and the students and I were all devastated by it, because this is California and people are coming from all over the world. And so when the US goes to war, people experience it as something very personal. So I think it's not clear how to stop the US war machine. And there's still the memory. I mean, we didn't talk about this, but it is core to the Panthers. I often talk about them in the domestic context, but the real core of the Panthers was anti-imperialism. And that was also a third world women's movement in the Bay Area. Like, that movement was centered in fighting the wars, looking to Asia. Also, their vision of the left was not a European vision. It was looking at Asia, and then it was looking at Cuba. So we've also seen a retreat, even in the Democratic Party, from anti-war stances. The thing that gives me some hope is the scale of mobilization around Palestine, that I think it's a way to once again open the can of worms that is US foreign policy. But, the Shepard Fairey portrait of Obama that said hope, all of us read this at the time as implicit in that had a lot to do with ending the wars. That's what the hope meant. It wasn't said, and it was abstract, as are so many things about Barack Obama, but that was the hope. And seeing Barack Obama use drones and kill Osama bin Laden and have his Tuesday night assassination sessions, and he always said he was going to escalate the war in Afghanistan, and he did. So I think that there's increasingly just this kind of sense of hopelessness about it. And the failure also, this is where, even though I said the Cold War hadn't ended, I was trained by people that came from countries that were fighting the United States, right? I knew people that had been parts of revolutions, that had been part of Grenada, that had seen successful struggles. And I think what's happened for younger generations of leftists is that they don't know people that have been part of struggles. This is one of the reasons they celebrate Assata Shakur, because she's seen as this transcendent figure who's broken out of federal penitentiary and ends up in Cuba. She's a kind of liberatory moment. But I think that that's part of it. Movements require hope. You cannot have any movement without hope. And I think that there is a deep shutting down right now in the US about the possibility of being able to really stop. We'll look at what the Middle East looks like. We have 5 different wars. We've seen the tearing apart of almost all of the Middle East. I mean, look at what's happened in Libya and Syria, in addition to Iraq, Afghanistan, and other countries, and Somalia, which we're not even talking about what's been done to Somalia.
And Egypt.
Yeah.
So I think, my sense is that there was a coherence to anti-colonial struggles after World War II, and they were seen as liberation struggles both across Africa. Vietnam fit into that, and people on the left in the U.S., including people in SNCC, Malcolm, lots of other people who are more radical, traveled to Africa or to these various other places, or to Cuba, and this struggle against colonialism, or in Cuba, U.S. controlled country, was fairly coherent, and I think it changed the intellectual narrative. It's partly responsible for the whole change in people looking at Southern history differently, which was controlled by right-wing pro Confederate people. That was so. This intellectual upheaval that took place was in the context of anti-imperialist and anti-colonial things. I think that things are very diffuse in that sense in the present period. People see all sorts of horrible things going on around the world, many of which can be tied to the United States, but some of which can't. Some of the things, Asia or the Uyghurs in China or Syria, don't fit into the coherent narrative that we had in the 60s and the 70s. So I think that that's what makes it difficult. Will that change and break through? You can cite the statistics that we spend more money on arms than the next 10 countries in the top 10 in terms of armament expenditures, but that's abstract. It's not as coherent. And I think the last end of that whole anti-colonial thing was the overthrow of apartheid in South Africa. And since that time, the resonance hasn't been there. Maybe the Palestinian struggle will reignite that, but it's in some sense standing there alone, not with dozens of other parallel struggles that seem to be taking place. At least that's my sense of what's going on and why it's harder to mobilize people internationally at this point than it was in the 60s and 70s.
Well, as I count us down, I'll just pick up on both the panelists' point about Palestine, because it does seem to me that this is where right now very significant number of people are coming into direct conflict with longstanding US foreign policy. The demonstrations that are building and the resonance, in my experience, is very considerable. The campus I'm on of 40,000 students at the University of Houston, far and away the largest, most active, most engaged student organization is Students for Justice in Palestine, without any doubt. And they're working constantly with BLM activists. Yesterday, we had about 3,000 people who just pushed through the police and took over the streets in the downtown commercial district of Houston. The police immediately grabbed a young Black male for arrest. And for 15 minutes, the police were surrounded by young people chanting, "Let him go." They did let him go. And there's a sense of defiance of American imperialism and American foreign policy with respect to Palestine, in which a young generation of Arab youth, Black youth, and just radicalizing young people who are getting connected with the movement. I think, Philip, in my experience, it's reopening the ground for anti-imperialist politics. We don't know, of course, how that will evolve and develop, but I sense that there's something very, very significant happening, and it's a global movement. Huge demonstration in Bogota, Colombia yesterday, enormous demonstration in London, England, somewhere close to 200,000. So maybe it will be Palestine that will crack open opposition to American foreign policy and train a new generation in anti-imperialism. So I want to finish by thanking so much Donna Murch and Michael Goldfield. I learned a huge amount from the conversation with both of you. And I want to thank Spectre Journal for sponsoring it. I want to thank Red May, Philip, Ron John, and all your volunteers for making this forum possible. I know it's been recorded, so when the link is available, we'll blast out over social media so that those who couldn't join us today can have the benefit of listening to this terrific session. Philip, back to you.
Thanks a lot, David, and thanks, Donna and Michael, for coming to be part of this forum. I also want to add that if you want to see the way Palestine almost bursts into every sort of, can burst at any moment into any space, go look at the video of COVID Corona Chronic Emergency forum that Red May did with Andreas Malm, Anselm Yape, and Alberto Toscano. I'll leave it to you to discover what happens and how it works. And I also want to say that those sensible people would retire now and go out to the park. We are not sensible at Red May, and we have another forum coming up on value, communism, and labor with Jasper Burns, Kailash Srinivasan, and Cordelia Belton. That's at 5 p.m. Pacific time, and I will be there too. So I hope to see you. Do go to our website and click the donate button. Well, we want to keep doing this stuff because, as David said, I think earlier, the notion of keeping alive a kind of left critical space as the neoliberal university cuts left and right, anything to do with the social science or history or something that doesn't have to do with what Obama called getting the skills to compete. I think it's important that we find all these kind of para spaces, the new monasteries, one would think, for critical thought that will keep it alive in what Brecht called dark times. So see you later at 5 p.m. and